Okay, we'll maybe just give it another minute or so. People are furiously joining the waiting room, so we'll get started in just a second with our seminar today. Welcome, everyone. A couple more folks coming on. Welcome everyone to this new seminar series. My internet will agree with me, called Critical Approaches to Critical Materials. And my name is Eric Shelter, and I'm the director of the Center for Sustainable Separations of Metals, which is an NSF Center for Chemical Innovation led out of the University of Pennsylvania. So CSSM is one of two institutional partners for this new seminar series, the other being the Minerals, Materials, and Society program from the University of Delaware, organized by Salim Ali and work and foster discussions at the interface of diverse areas such as political science, humanities, social science, chemistry, material science, in the area of especially critical materials research. So we're launching the series today, and please stay tuned for the growth of this series into the fall of 2021. So we're going to have a lot of spectacular speakers lined up to come. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Julie Klinger, who will introduce today's speaker.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, we're delighted to, on behalf of the Minerals Materials Society program at the University of Delaware, we're delighted to partner with CSSM in this joint seminar series. Although we focus on different things, both of our programs are focused on finding solutions, whether in the domain of science, technology, policy, or society, to the current critical resource challenges that we're confronting at multiple levels of our societies. And we're especially keen to learn from critical, grounded, grassroots, and other forms of participatory action research and publicly engaged scholarship that helps us see the critical materials we're studying within their broader social, environmental, and political contexts. We're keenly aware that we're in a critical moment in which we are facing a rapidly closing window to act in order to avoid the worst predictions of climate change unfolding in this century and beyond. And in this moment, we also appreciate more than ever that research that unflinchingly engages the complexities of our mineral resource issues is more important than ever. And so with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Thea Riofrancos as our inaugural speaker. So Dr. Riofrancos is a distinguished researcher and public intellectual. She is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a Radcliffe Institute Fellow, and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College. Her research focuses on resource extraction, renewable energy, climate change, green technology, social movements, and the left in Latin America. So these themes are explored in her book, which was her first book, which was published last year, called Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, as well as in other peer-reviewed articles and essays for numerous prominent popular publications. And she also has a co-authored book entitled A Planet to Win: Why We Need a Green New Deal, which was published with Verso Books in 2019. So she's previously been a visiting researcher at numerous institutes throughout South America, as well as at Notre Dame here in the US. Dr. Riofrancos holds a PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania and a BA from Reed College. So one quick housekeeping matter, feel free throughout the talk to throw questions into the chat, understanding that we will wait until the end of the talk to address them. And I will moderate the Q&A with Thea. And with that also, please join me in welcoming, in whatever form is appropriate, applause or jazz hands or using the appropriate emoji, Dr. Thea Riofrancos. Thea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that warm introduction. And I think Julie will probably notice, and maybe others of her colleagues will notice, that her work has been very influential especially in this current project and in some of the ways that I'm approaching lithium supply chains here, her work on rare earths frontiers and our many conversations over the years. So that was a wonderful introduction for those reasons. And I also want to thank Eric and Salim for helping to coordinate this. And just so great to see so many folks in the room interested in critical minerals, and a few familiar faces as well. So without further ado, I will get us started here with this presentation that cooperates with me. There we go. Okay. Oh, and actually one more housekeeping note is that this is ongoing work. I'll say that again or during the presentation, but I want to make it clear because I'm actually very interested in the feedback in spaces like this, and that will directly sort of influence how I frame things going forward. And so I'm really interested in the comments and questions. So we tend to think of the climate crisis, which Julie already mentioned in the opening remarks, in terms of extreme weather and rising seas. And we often think of the politics of the climate crisis in terms of tense international negotiations over emissions targets, and also the unfortunate diplomatic gridlock that often marks those negotiations. These emissions targets and negotiations around them are, of course, extremely important. The world is currently on a concerning path to warming far above the Paris Agreement's 2-degree goal and much further above the UN IPCC's goal of 1.5 degrees. The justice implications of this rapid warming are very stark. Everywhere in the world, at every scale, those least responsible for runaway emissions are most vulnerable to climate-related harm. But as exemplified in the current debates in US Congress over trillions of dollars in infrastructure spending, the politics of global warming are just as much about how societies will be transformed to mitigate and adapt to rising temperatures and more frequent hurricanes, floods, and droughts. How those dollars are spent will help determine how much the world heats up. They will also determine how societies change in the years ahead. This social scientific aspect of the climate crisis, the social science of green investment, demands, in my view, far more attention than it's currently getting. After all, a clean energy transition requires the wide-scale deployment of green technologies to harness, store, and distribute renewable energy, to electrify entire sectors of the economy, and to transform the built environment, retrofitting homes, redesigning grids, and building new transportation infrastructure. These transformations raise deep questions. Who will control the global transition to renewable energy? Who will benefit and who will bear the costs? Will the transition reinforce or reduce inequality? The energy transition will also challenge how we think about these power relations. We tend to think of inequality as existing either between countries or within countries. But the global and multi-scalar dynamics of green capitalism compel us to understand how these dimensions intersect and generate new geographies. And these geographies will be shaped by specific minerals. Oil will matter less, but cobalt, iron ore, rare earths, and lithium will matter more. With lithium batteries instead of combustion engines, cars and buses can get their energy directly from the grid and be fueled by sun and wind instead of carbon spewing gasoline. Utility scale batteries also perform a crucial function on those renewable energy grids, storing energy when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Lithium batteries, which power cell phones and laptops, are therefore essential for addressing the climate crisis. They play a key role in decarbonizing the transportation sector, which is the single largest source of US emissions at around 30%, and a large source of global emissions at around 15%. But while lithium is needed to mitigate global warming, its extraction causes concerning environmental and social impacts. For these reasons, lithium battery supply chains offer a window into the global injustices and also the emerging geopolitics of the renewable energy transition. Oops, that went backwards. There we go. I first understood this in the desert landscapes of northern Chile, which supply 30% of the world's lithium. The salty crust is peppered with red lagoons, where pink Andean flamingos endemic to this ecosystem feed on tiny brine shrimp. Beneath the surface are underground brine reservoirs. In those deposits, lithium ions are dissolved in water that's saltier than the ocean. In addition to flamingos, the salt flat is home to massive installations where brine is pumped to the surface and arrayed in evaporation ponds that, with the sun's help, result in a dense lithium-rich liquid. This is the very first link in a long chain of electrochemical processing and industrial manufacturing that produces lithium batteries. The impacts on this water system of this desert wetland are quite concerning. Just one of the two multinational lithium companies that operates on the Salar pumps out brine at a rate of 1,700 liters a second. 95% of this water is then evaporated. Extracting lithium thus involves drying up a lot of water and throwing most of it into the air in the second driest place on Earth after Antarctica. As a result, fresh water is less available to the 18 indigenous Atacameño communities that live on the salt flats perimeter, and habitats of species like the flamingo have been disrupted. This situation is exacerbated by climate change-induced drought and the impacts of extracting and processing another mineral, copper, of which Chile is the world's top producer. And it's worth noting that copper also, like lithium, plays a key role in electrification and decarbonization. Compounding these environmental harms, the Chilean state has not enforced indigenous peoples' right to prior consultation or lithium workers' rights to unionize without retaliation. As I've discovered over a decade of researching extractive sectors in Latin America, these conditions are unfortunately commonplace at the frontiers of capitalism's global supply chains, the sites where raw materials like iron, soy, timber, coal, rare earths, and water required for industrial production are extracted or harvested. In the case of lithium batteries, these include nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, copper, aluminum, and of course, lithium, which I will focus on in today's talk. Extracting these minerals from the Earth's crust at industrial scale carries grave consequences for wildlife, freshwater, and marine ecosystems, and produces enormous quantities of toxic waste. It exposes affected communities to harms, including respiratory ailments, territorial dispossession, and outright violence. Mine workers face severe health and safety risks and mineral protections. And all of these threats to well-being are compounded by paltry economic benefits and a stark contrast between mining company profits and poverty-afflicted mining communities. Indigenous environmental and human rights activists call these extractive frontiers sacrifice zones. In the case of lithium extraction, they use the term green extractivism to target the tension of fighting climate change while producing localized environmental damage. At the same time, the geopolitics of green technologies are reconfiguring the geography of extraction, expanding lithium frontiers to countries in the global north that have long offshored toxic sectors to the global south. This geographic and territorial shift poses challenges and opportunities for a globally just transition. I'm sorry that my thing is a bit wonky today. I don't know why that is. There we go. Okay, so in what follows, I'll say more about my methods and sites. Then I'll give an overview of the raw material requirements of the energy transition. With that context in place, I'll walk us through three forces that I argue are shaping lithium extraction at a planetary scale: what I call green statecraft, green capitalism, and resistance to green extractivism. These dynamics are relevant beyond the sector at hand. Lithium batteries are much more than a tool to combat climate change. They are emerging as terrains of geopolitical and social conflict, bellwethers of a potentially post-neoliberal global order, and new frontiers in the capitalist appropriation of nature. Today, I'm presenting initial findings of an ongoing project tracing the global political economy of lithium battery supply chains, with a focus on the public policies, corporate strategies, and grassroots protest shaping their extractive frontiers. Thus far, I've conducted 4 months of immersive fieldwork in Chile and observed 3 major industry conventions. I've interviewed over 60 actors, including corporate executives, regulators, investors, scientists, lawyers, indigenous leaders, union organizers, environmental activists, and NGO staff in Chile, the US, UK, and EU. Given obvious COVID limitations, for the past year, I've conducted virtual ethnography and actually learned about some of the benefits of it that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, observing industry and activist webinars, and also analyzing government and corporate documents and media coverage. As restrictions ease, I plan to return to Chile, as well as conducting new fieldwork in Nevada and Portugal. Those sites, it'll become clear a bit later why those sites are important. These actors, places, events, and texts give me perspective on a process that's unfolding on a planetary scale. And here I'm following the work of critical geographers and others who look at sort of a planetary mind. Minds and their surrounding communities and landscapes, strategies devised in corporate boardrooms, and public policies developed in the halls of state power, NGO pressure campaigns, environmental lawsuits, and territorial blockades erected by anti-extractive protesters. These are all instances of what we should see as a planetary lithium frontier, co-constituted by local sites and global processes. Here, the global process is the renewable energy transition, a transformation with parallels in the 19th century shift to coal and the 20th century shifts to oil as well as natural gas. I investigate the thoroughly material foundations of a transition often discussed in terms of gleaming technologies and carbon-free energy, rather than in terms of the enormous quantities of earthly matter that will be extracted to build a world powered by sun and wind. To grasp this materiality and impacts on ecosystems and populations, let's take a look at the forecast for the mineral requirements of green technologies like wind turbines, solar panels, lithium batteries, and electric vehicles. So, for example, the World Bank predicts that by 2050, the production of what it calls new energy technologies will increase demand of graphite and lithium by 500%, and nearly 500% for cobalt. Given skyrocketing demand for these minerals, along with prospects for a robust, though of course thoroughly unequal, global economic recovery, market analysts predict a commodity supercycle. In fact, we might already be in the beginning stages of one, a period of sustained high prices for raw materials. In the global south, commodity booms provide economic revenues, but they also devastate communities and ecosystems and give rise to social resistance. These patterns, of course, play out in the US as well, now the top global producer of oil and gas and site of militant protests against fracking and pipelines. Where will these raw materials come from? Who will control and benefit from their extraction? And who will pay the social and environmental costs? I argue that 3 key forces at play. The first is green statecraft. In the context of a new wave of mineral extraction for crucial green technologies, policymakers around the world are jockeying to control supply chains from beginning to end. In February, President Biden decreed a review of supply chains for, quote, critical and essential goods. 2 of the 4 goods listed are high capacity batteries, including electric vehicles, and, quote, critical minerals. The stated motivation is reducing vulnerability to, quote, production shortages, trade disruptions, natural disasters, and potential actions by foreign competitors and adversaries. In the White House's view, resilient supply chains also bring opportunities, well-paid jobs, technological innovation, and national security. And they offer the benefit of bipartisan consensus. Quote, supply chain security is a rare point of agreement across the political divide. In justifying the need to onshore critical minerals, US policymakers and their EU and UK counterparts often imply that these resources are scarce. But although lithium is currently extracted from a few countries, this element is in fact abundant in the Earth's crust. Despite this abundance, it is possible that a supply crunch could occur in the short or medium term. After multiple false starts and then a global recession, EV markets are finally taking off and increasing demand for batteries and lithium. This takeoff of EV markets has been predicted every year for the past several years, and now it looks like it is finally happening, and thus will result in sustained and high demand for minerals such as lithium. In response, there are many new lithium projects planned around the world, and I'll get to a few of them in a moment, but they take time to develop. And this is especially the case for brine projects, which have long evaporation periods, and also for more speculative and technologically innovative clay and geothermal deposits that are, for the most part, still in a kind of pilot and feasibility stage. As a result, there is always a lag between upticks in demand and availability of new supplies. However, I want to emphasize this, and this is, I think, a key insight from work in critical geography. The precise year that this bottleneck occurs, the degree to which it affects battery manufacturing, is contingent on how fast production at existing and new lithium projects can ramp up, on battery chemistry and battery design, and on recycling capacity and ability to recover materials. It also, of course, fundamentally depends on how aggressively governments promote EV adoption. Policies that instead favor public transit, improve materials recovery, and reduce the resource intensity of battery design, in turn reduce the demand for lithium. Thus, the volume of extraction is never a given or an objective parameter, but an outcome of political and economic decisions. Despite this contingency, state actors invoke tropes of scarcity with historic roots in imperialism and recently salient in the context of the so-called New Cold War with China. They describe a scramble or a race to secure battery minerals and equate controlling extraction in territorial terms with geopolitical status and national security. In this spirit, the EU Commission sees lithium batteries and electric vehicles as a top regional priority, spurring a flurry of lithium projects and battery factories within EU borders. They've also proposed a sustainable battery policy that aims to increase the recycled content and reduce the carbon footprint of production. This represents an emerging pattern across the global north, where policymakers justify expanding lithium mining in the name of both security and sustainability, often in the process conflating the two. This conflation is not a verbal slip. As multiple interviewees have attested, political elites see sustainable and, quote, ethical production as the West's last hope to reassert its manufacturing prowess as the one terrain on which they can successfully compete with China. The mantra that environmental sustainability and national security are intimately connected and best achieved through territorialized control of supply chains is redrawing the map of lithium extraction. New projects are advancing in the EU, UK, and US, in many cases with public financing, on public lands, or with other forms of state support. Such projects are in some cases owned by the same multinationals that operate in Australia, Chile, and Argentina, currently the top global producers in descending order. It is to these private companies that I now turn. Lithium miners and electric vehicle firms are also growing concerned about the, quote, sustainability and even ethics of raw materials. Two pieces of context help explain why. First are the dramatic economic implications of electrifying transportation. Lithium-ion batteries are transforming the 2 trillion, or some people call it 3 trillion, I've seen both of those figures, regardless, the multi-trillion-dollar global auto industry, an industry that has seen years of declining demand in the global north. Automakers know that they need public policies that will stimulate EV demand and shore up EV production. And for those reasons, they are very attentive to the politics of the energy transition. Second, in a world racked by climate and environmental crises and increasing public awareness and contention around both, these firms know that green branding is an advantage, though also a potential liability. As a result, lithium and EV companies are competing over sustainability, or at least the consumer perception of it. A few examples will illustrate. Over the past year alone, Volkswagen organized a site visit to the Atacama Salt Flat, my field site that I mentioned earlier, to investigate concerns about water use. Likewise, BMW commissioned a team of scientists to study the impacts of brine extraction on freshwater. Volkswagen and Mercedes partnered up with the same consulting firm to ensure, quote, responsible sourcing of raw materials. And Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and Ford have committed to only procure lithium and cobalt from certified responsible suppliers. These firms have also made a slew of public statements touting sustainability and ethics. Mercedes refers to its, quote, sustainability offensive. BMW promises to uphold, quote, high environmental and social standards throughout the entire value chain. Volkswagen, perhaps most ambitiously, asserts that the, quote, raw materials for our electric batteries must be extracted under sustainable conditions that ensure that the extraction of lithium does not harm people or nature. These corporate moves are putting pressure on upstream suppliers. This, in effect, externalizes the cost of green and ethical sourcing, or the appearance of it, onto those upstream extractive firms. In clear response, lithium companies like SQM and Albemarle, which are two of the top 5 global lithium companies, and the 2 that operate in Chile, I should say, have made commitments to reduce their carbon footprint and water use and ensure that benefits flow to communities. They have sought certification to ensure their commitment to the environment and human rights. Green branding, however, isn't the only reason that lithium companies are promising to do better. In addition, these firms are the direct target of community resistance. In fact, local protest also explains the moves that downstream car manufacturers are making. As consumer-facing companies, they are sensitive to bad publicity, especially investigative journalism and NGO pressure, like Amnesty International's ongoing efforts to bring attention to battery supply chains. But what prompted these media reports and NGO campaigns in the first place, according to my interviews, are the grievances and protests of directly affected communities. So community protest has this direct and indirect effect on different nodes of the supply chains. For all these reasons, downstream firms like Volkswagen are exerting more control over extractive frontiers. These moves are additionally motivated by a concern about market availability of raw materials, the supply crunch that I mentioned earlier. Private firms thus mirror the dual preoccupations of green statecraft, sustainability, and security. Car companies are signing long-term contracts with miners and even getting directly involved in extractive projects. In a potential shift away from the neoliberal mantra or post-Fordist mantra, depending on your preferred concept, of flexible, just-in-time production, these companies are in effect tightening supply chains. Ironically, these strategies exacerbate the underlying concern that motivates them in the first place. Long-term contracts constrain market availability and contribute to market concentration, rendering supplies less elastic with respect to demand. What are the implications of these different state and corporate strategies for communities and ecosystems? I'll now turn to the third and final factor that I argue is shaping lithium frontiers, the resistance proliferating transnationally across the zones of extraction. Around the world, environmental and indigenous activists are scrutinizing battery and EV supply chains. As noted, such activism is a direct and indirect cause of new corporate practices touting ethics and sustainability. But these corporate responsibility promises don't themselves resolve conflict. Rather, activists target firms for falling short of professed commitments to protect the environment and human rights and to combat climate change. As lithium extraction expands, intensifying in top producers like Chile at the same time that it moves to new zones in the EU and US, I've observed resistance movements articulate a shared set of grievances and demands across this broad geography. As I described, I first witnessed the injustices of lithium extraction in the deserts of northern Chile. The 18 indigenous communities that ring the Atacama Salt Flat, which act collectively via the Committee of Atacameño Peoples, have opposed new lithium projects and called for an overhaul of regulations governing the sector. They've used tactics such as roadblock blockades and successfully worked through the legal system, prompting more stringent environmental requirements for SQM, one of the 2 companies operating on the salt flat. Simultaneously, and often in coordination with the committee, the Plurinational Salt Flat Observatory, which links activists across borders in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, organizes protests and educational events. The observatory, which I participate in, asserts that desert wetlands, volcanic mountains, endemic wildlife, and thousands of years of indigenous culture should be prioritized above rapacious extraction. The grievances motivating these protests and lawsuits are myriad, but the primary focus is the effect of brine extraction on vulnerable water systems already at risk due to copper mining's tremendous freshwater consumption and the localized effects of global warming. Chilean activists articulate a trenchant critique of green extractivism and eco-coloniality, and the sacrifice zones where people and ecosystems are rendered disposable in the name of mitigating climate change. These tactics are proliferating far beyond Chile. And as we'll see, neither lithium extraction nor frontline resistance to it are limited to the global South. Despite the limitations on travel in this moment, anti-extractive activists use digital tools to forge connections, diffusing language and tactics. Linking together far-flung zones of extraction, they resist a new wave of mining unleashed by green technologies. This movement is growing in Europe in direct response to the EU's commitment to expand lithium extraction within its borders. Portugal is a hotspot of the EU's lithium push and a protest against it. Although currently a small producer in global terms, Portugal's lithium sector is the largest on the continent. The planned Mina do Barroso project in the verdant hills of the country's north has sparked an outcry due to concerns over impact on watersheds, local livelihoods like farming and ecotourism, communally owned land, and cultural heritage sites. Activists have used multiple tactics, ranging from public demonstrations to passing municipal anti-mining resolutions. They participate in anti-mining networks at the national, regional, and global scale. As a result, they have forced concessions from the Portuguese government, including repeated delays to the international tender for lithium exploration and the removal of particular areas from consideration altogether. Among the most recent sites of conflict along the expanding extractive frontier is here in the United States. Lithium Nevada is planning to exploit a claystone deposit at Thacker Pass in the northern reaches of the state. The project, once in operation, will be the second lithium mine on US soil. Lithium Nevada is a subsidiary of Canadian mining company Lithium Americas, which is developing a brine project in Argentina in a joint venture with Chinese company Ganfeng, to give you a sense of the corporate connections across borders. This past January, the mine received a green light from the Bureau of Land Management, a necessary step as it sits on public land, in a fast-tracked process that environmentalists and community members saw as papering over impacts such as threats to the habitats of wildlife species like the sage grouse and golden eagle that are already experiencing decline. Like in Chile and Portugal, resistance is multifaceted, encompassing legal tactics and protest. A coalition of environmental groups and a local rancher have filed lawsuits. Last week, the Fort Dermick Paiute Shoshone Tribal Council announced, 2 weeks ago, announced the cancellation of a prior agreement with Lithium Nevada and initiated a lawsuit. In addition to impacts on wildlife, the tribe has cited threats to their land, water, hunting and gathering areas, and sacred ceremonial sites, including one that sits literally in the center of the Thacker Pass mine site. Thacker Pass has also seen a growing protest encampment, drawing environmentalists, tribal members, as well as ranchers and other residents. Meanwhile, echoing the elite discourse that resonates across business and government on both sides of the Atlantic, lithium executives promoting the project have appealed to national security and environmental sustainability. As one executive put it, Thacker Pass would be, quote, critical for establishing a strong domestic lithium supply chain required to support a low carbon economy. Another executive favorably compared the project with brine extraction in South America, which activists have targeted for its water impact, noting, quote, we recycle a lot of water. We actually generate carbon-free energy from our process, end quote. But activists aren't convinced and have called out the company for greenwashing an open pit mine and related facilities that will occupy nearly 18,000 acres of public land and extractive processes involving chemical reagents and large quantities of water, which will leave behind waste in the form of rock piles and toxic streams. We are in the beginnings of an uncertain transition. This transition isn't merely a switch from hydrocarbons to renewable energy, as if that could happen in a vacuum. Confronting the climate emergency and creating resilient communities requires transforming the built environment, changing where and how we live, work, eat, travel, commute, and spend leisure time, with implications for every single sector of the economy. These changes can help mitigate global warming and adapt to the already baked in extreme weather, sea level rise, and drought. But they also pose complex challenges for political economy and social justice. These changes can unfold in ways that reinforce hierarchies locally, nationally, and globally, or upend them, building a greener and more egalitarian world at the same time. I won't pretend to have all the right responses to these weighty challenges, which will surely be shaped by collective decisions and intense political battles between the forces competing to shape our planetary future. But my ongoing research on lithium battery supply chains reveals ominous developments and some inspiring possibilities for the path forward. To conclude, I will mention two. First is the new political salience of supply chains, and in particular, supply chain security. To see this as a shift, it's worth recalling how avidly politicians across the ideological spectrum in the US, UK, and Europe promoted the tenets of globalization, comparative advantage, economic efficiency, free trade, and global market integration. Now, in rhetoric and to an extent in policy, political elites in the global north are questioning these tenets, and doing so first and foremost in the realm of technologies like lithium batteries. This shift has many sources, some longer term, like declining productivity, deindustrialization, and secular stagnation in the world's wealthiest countries, and some more immediate, such as the pandemic. But even perhaps more than these factors, policymakers consistently invoke China's rapid economic ascent and the Chinese government's use of policy tools that flout the neoliberal consensus. Given that from the transatlantic slave trade and colonial conquest, capitalism has always been globetrotting, I'm skeptical that deglobalization or slowbalization is imminent. But I worry all the same about the pernicious effects of securitizing and dominating supply chains. When economic policy is seen through the lens of national security, states expand their coercive capacities. In addition, the so-called New Cold War undermines the interstate cooperation needed to combat climate change, cooperation that must take the form not only of shared emissions targets, but also of the globally equitable access to green technologies like lithium batteries. In addition, as we're seeing right now with Thacker Pass, the race to secure raw minerals is already incentivizing rapacious extraction with fewer environmental and social protections, and might bring more state repression of the protest against it. This brings me to my second point. We are, as I've said throughout this talk, in a moment of transition. Transitions are critical junctures, moments that are more open to contingencies and higher stakes. The decisions made in such moments have enduring effects into the future. Right now, the choice is between, on the one hand, greener forms of capitalism and imperialism, or on the other, transformations that simultaneously tackle emissions, inequality, and environmental damage. The transportation sector exemplifies this fork in the road, pun intended. We can swap traditional cars for electric vehicles, maintaining auto-dominated landscapes, the suburban sprawl and highways, and the race and class segregation they enforce, and incentivizing huge volumes of extraction. Or we can expand, electrify, and make more equitable our mass transit systems, experiment with car-free cities that are more amenable to walking and cycling. Such an approach would still require lithium, but less of it. And fewer cars on the road facilitates decarbonization, making it easier to slash emissions. We could also ensure that trade agreements enforce indigenous and labor rights and encode environmental protections. We could redesign industrial policies to embrace sustainable materials, recycling, and an ethic of repair. A world of climate safety and of less extraction, and fewer of the social and environmental harms that come with both, is possible. And that's the world I think we should envision and advocate for. Thank you, and I look forward to your feedback, comments, and questions.
All right, thank you so much. If we were all in a room together, you'd get a resounding round of applause, but for now you have emojis and jazz hands. Thank you so much for sharing also this work in progress. It's such a privilege to see it, you know, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us from amidst the process of your research. We have a handful of pretty interesting questions that I think are reflective of the diverse disciplinary backgrounds that we have in this seminar today. A very first one is actually, it's from Jonathan Sessler, and it has to do with the information that you shared at the very beginning of your presentation about, you know, the rate of water pumping and into evaporation ponds. And Jonathan Sessler says, is there any evidence that evaporating somewhere around 1,700 liters per second of water is affecting the local climate in a positive way by potentially increasing the humidity of the air?
That is such a great question that has neither occurred to me nor that I've seen direct research on. So I'm going to look into it, but I'm going to attempt to answer it despite it being a novel question for me. So it is possible that that is happening, but from what I've read about local climatic conditions, I think that that is far outweighed by the drought-inducing effects of global climate change on desert regions, right? So we know that around the world, deserts are getting more desert-like, and regions that aren't deserts are becoming desertified. And so that process is playing out in what I already mentioned is in fact the driest desert on Earth and second driest place on Earth, the Atacama Desert. And so the levels of evaporation are increasing, the availability of water is decreasing, and this is notable in, or observable, I should say, in anecdotal everyday people's experience, but also quite borne out by scientific studies as well. So if there's a countervailing effect of localized humidity, it's completely washed out, it seems, by the desertification effect of global warming. But let me say one other thing, because this question, while it's specific in what it's interested in, I think maybe raises the question of why is this there is such an effect on water in the first place of lithium extraction, which I didn't fully explain. I gloss over it kind of quickly. And it's a really interesting area of ongoing hydrogeological research that I'm not a hydrogeologist or a geologist or a hard scientist of any sort, but I'm reading this research both because I'm interested in the social and political effects of the lack of water access, right? That's something that in general in extractive sectors really tends to trigger protest when there are effects on water. But also because, as I suggested briefly in the talk, the science itself has become very politicized, right? I mentioned that car companies are hiring scientists, including some of the best scientists in the world on these topics, some of the most renowned brine geologists, right? And they're doing that because companies specifically want to contest the claim or refute the claim that brine extraction impacts freshwater, right? And they want to refute it because they know that once water is at issue, communities will really intense protest tends to follow, right? And also forms of regulation tend to follow. And so they're trying to meet this head on. And what they do is make a very sharp distinction in their company kind of language and rhetoric between brine and freshwater. And I have like another paper on this that would also be interesting to talk about in this group that wasn't what I was presenting today on this brine versus freshwater distinction. What the scientists that are not directly working for companies say, and what also Chilean regulators say, is that there is no such hard distinction between the salty part of the water system and the freshwater part of the water system. There is in fact a porous connection and interface between the brine that sits underneath the nucleus of the salt flat and the freshwater system that begins at its perimeter, that these water systems literally interface one another. And I think this will be easy to understand, at least it was for me as a political scientist, and there are folks that are much more expert in water systems than me here, that when you pull down the brine by sucking it out, you actually move the interface, right? You move through gravity and through the differential density. the freshwater table, and it makes it less, you're not taking out the water, though some water is removed for processing, but the effect is actually more the gravitational pulling effect than it is the direct removal of fresh water. Simultaneously, in the same exact water table, copper companies are extracting loads of fresh water at a similarly astronomical rate. So you get the sense of this sort of dual pressure, and the idea that brine and freshwater can't be neatly distinguished. They're part of a shared hydrogeological system. And even if they could be distinguished, let's just say hypothetically, brine plays an essential role in the ecosystem because microorganisms live in it, and those microorganisms are the prey of larger organisms, right? And so brine in and of itself has ecological and potentially scientific and even economic value. And there's a lot of interesting research on those microorganisms, but it also affects the freshwater availability for human consumption, agricultural use, et cetera. So that's just a little water overview, but I feel like the question, while specific, raised these broader issues of the water impacts.
Thank you so much for that explanation. I mean, it's possible also to, based on the image that you provided us, it's also possible to see how one could make a claim that brine extraction for lithium mining doesn't actually quantitatively reduce the fresh water that's available. But of course, the key question there is it actually accessible by the communities, given these sort of biogeophysical changes that take place? So there's a set of questions or discussion in the chat around sacrifice zones and indigenous peoples, and I'll save those for the third question. The second one I'd like to pose now was offered by Zane Cooper and seconded by Ellie Armstrong. And the question is this: how are imaginaries of a future technological or energy sublime being communicated on the ground at your field sites? Are you seeing aesthetic and discursive trends emerging across sites from Chile to Nevada to Portugal? I'm really interested in unpacking the rhetoric. And Zane, I'm sure you know, is studying mining and cryptocurrency in Greenland and the Arctic, right? It has excellent scholarship on these ideas of energy and technological sublimes as well.
Yeah, Zane is someone that we need to have a one-on-one conversation one day. I feel like we've interacted a lot on Twitter and actually had pretty substantive interactions, as that platform goes. But I'm sure that we'll have a conversation at some point in the near future. So thanks for that question, which I love. You'll tell me afterwards if I've answered it, since you're using the word sublime, which is a specific kind of techno-futurist imaginary. I'm going to zoom out a little bit because it's not all communicated in the register of the sublime, let's say, but I think there's a lot of interesting techno-futurist imaginaries, and they are moving across borders. And they also speak to, or they're inflected by, differential positionings in the world order in interesting ways, right? So I started my fieldwork in Chile. I started this project in Chile. And when this project started, it was really going to be about Chile. And now it's still about Chile, but it also has some other sites. And so I've, in my own research process, kind of followed these narratives as they travel across borders and begun to include new sites precisely because of their key role in consolidating narratives and policy practices, hence the moves to Nevada and Portugal. What I noticed in Chile was, I think, two forms of this techno-futurist narrative. And one that's like newer, more contemporary, and one that is older and more developmentalist. So the newer narrative is very much shared across policy, sort of like mining corporate elites around the world. And Chile, it's important to note, is, I said this in the presentation, I just want to underscore it. It's the #1 global producer of copper, right? And it's #2 in lithium. So mining, and not just any mining, but mining for like the green future, is like very much like Chile's kind of, sectoral thing. And so what policymakers that I spoke to in the state, and also their corporate counterparts, were really pushing was this notion of green mining, of responsible mining, of what's sometimes called climate smart mining. So mining that minimizes, or even in some cases zeroes out, the effects on the environment in this imaginary, right? There is no actual way to have no effect on the earth when you are mining a non-renewable resource. Like some trace is left always, right? I don't think there's such a thing as like sustainable mining of a non-renewable resource. There is better and worse, right? So I don't want to say all mining is equally terrible, but it's all just gradations of like, what is the degree of impact? Not is there a possibility of zero impact? But mining policymakers in Chile talk as if the effects on water, climate, and local ecosystems can be totally zeroed out, either preventatively or through offsetting or other kinds of after the fact kind of processes, right? Or through just replacement substitution processes. Like, for example, we've already spoken a bit about water. So one way to make mining has, quote, zero effect on water is through desalination, right? Anyone in the room that knows anything about desalination knows that it's an incredibly impactful process that's super energy intensive, and also both at the sites of desalination, but also transiting water over large distances means lots of diesel powered trucks for the time being. I mean, it creates its own pollution nightmare. So these are the kinds of imaginaries that are used in Chile, and Chile is at the forefront of the global mining sector. And so these very much diffuse transnationally, in both directions. So that's one set of discourses. A different set of discourses that has an older origin, but is being like retooled for the sort of 20th, 21st century moment is the developmentalist dream of moving up the value of moving up the ladder of value added production, right? So in a place like Chile, that despite, being touted as like the investor friendly, wealthiest place in Latin America, that whole narrative has a lot of holes and absences in it we could get to regardless. Despite that image, Chile is a producer of raw materials, right? It is a wealthier one, and with a more variegated sort of extractive portfolio, a little less totally impacted by volatile global prices because it has a few major exports. But nonetheless, it is a peripheral, it's a dependent kind of, economically dependent country on the peripheries of the world system in sort of dependency theory terms. And so what policymakers in Chile have long wanted to do and have more or less successfully achieved, depending on the sector, is to industrialize. And what this looks like with lithium is to go from exporting lithium carbonate, basically, which is like a semi-refined lithium product, to getting closer to producing cathodes, to maybe getting towards producing battery cells. And the way that they have marketed that policy goal is by, literally marketed it and figuratively, is by guaranteeing lower prices for lithium for any company that does value-added stuff that moves to Chile, right? And it hasn't worked. I mean, unfortunately, or whatever, depending on one's perspective, it has not worked. Like, they have had this deal, it has not worked out. Factories, Samsung has not moved to Chile, right? And so this is another techno-imaginary, which is more about increasingly technologically sophisticated production. I want to just add one last thing, because Zane is bringing up, again, the transnational diffusion, but also difference. And something that's interesting to me is that Chile and Australia, by the way, another, the top producer of lithium globally, are trying to move up the value chain. Whereas in other places, they're trying to move in both directions, right? In the US and the EU, in the UK, they're not just trying to incentivize battery manufacturing, which they are, but they're also trying to incentivize raw material production, right? So there's just like different sort of directions on the ladder that different countries are attempting to move, but it's all with this idea that territorially kind of controlling as much of the green tech supply chain is in the national economic and political interest.
Right, excellent, thank you so much. So Salim Ali has a hand raised. So I'd like to invite Salim to contribute, and also to note to all of our participants that we'll aim to wrap up at about 5 minutes past the hour. So please stick around until then. If you can. There's such great questions in the chat, and I'd like to make sure that we can at least touch on them all. Celine?
Thanks so much, Thea. It was fantastic. Just one point of clarification and perhaps contention. When you said that mining is inherently unsustainable, since we have a group of chemists in the audience, the way we define sustainability many times in chemistry is in terms of the elements themselves if you have a chemical reaction, you convert them into another form, but they are still elements. So, you've got the copper, and the copper has gone into the roof of some church or something, but the copper is still there. The issue is you can actually circle back the copper into the economy. It's just that you need to inject energy to do that. So I think unpacking the sustainability question in social science is important, because otherwise people just kind of have a dead end there. They just don't want to say, okay, mining is inherently unsustainable, but it's a little bit more complicated. We can talk about urban mining. We can talk about, retrieving the metals from way back. And I was wondering if you have engaged in that discourse as well as a solution to some of these issues.
Yeah, I love the pushback. I think we are, as you in a way noted, referring to different objects of analysis with the word sustainable. But it's very useful what you're bringing in, which is the entire supply chain view and a sort of circular economy approach to recovery in a way that, yes, there is some energy requirements in order to close the loop. So it's not fully an fully internal loop, but nonetheless, at the materials level, it could be, in theory and in laboratory practice, though not in economic reality, unfortunately yet, a fully closed loop. And what I mean is that in laboratory settings, something like 95% of lithium can be recovered. It's not recovered at anything like that rates. It's very hard to actually measure how much lithium is recovered for reasons I could get into, but it's like maybe 5-10% maximum. And it's not because it's not economic to do so, because quote, I hate this term. And someone Julie, tell me a better term, because it's so gendered and sexist, but it's virgin mining. I don't like to use it. New mining maybe is a good substitution, but
Greenfields also.
Greenfields, yeah. I just wanted to be evocative for people that aren't mining experts in the room, but basically mining, thus far untapped deposits is cheaper than recovering the lithium, but that cheapness is artificial, right? It's like if we had regulations that made it more expensive to mine new and made it cheaper, subsidized recovery, that price dynamic would flip, right? So it just shows you, I think, how much prices are not objective constraints, they're outcomes of policy decisions, relative prices, I mean. So Salim, sorry, that was a little bit of a digression, but I just wanted to kind of expand on that. When I say mining isn't sustainable, I almost entirely mean at the immediate sites of extraction. And what I mean by it not being sustainable is twofold. One is that there is a limit in the underlying reserve. Of course, limits are also flexible, but they are ultimately not flexible, meaning, we can discover new ways to extract new reserves, but there is, in theory, a given quantity of lithium out there. So it's not sustainable because it's non-renewable, but it's also not sustainable because there isn't a way to extract even the most environmentally friendly forms of lithium extraction that are more or less in a pilot phase, like direct filtration of lithium ions, involves some loss. Something is lost, whether it's energy, whether it's ecosystem impacts, or water usage or whatever. And however, I do think that post-extraction, all the other nodes could be more or less circularly closed. And that, as Julie's work also shows, the more you close that loop, the less extraction you need, right? But it's a dynamic relationship. I think we basically agree, but it's a very good, it's a very good point. Thank you for that.
Excellent. Thank you for that generative discussion. We're going to do, our last question is going to be a triple decker of a question.
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay, so Eric Shelter asked in the chat, do you think sacrifice zones could emerge in the US given an America First push to invigorate domestic supply chains, right? And Salim contributed some useful resources in the chat about the history already of the US locating extractive enterprises on indigenous lands in particular. And the second part of this, triple layer cake here is from Mark Jensen. Are there substantial touch points for comparison between the effects of, quote, energy extraction on indigenous people? He's thinking specifically of uranium extraction in the American Southwest compared to lithium extraction in South America. And to that, I want to add, I'm going to exercise my liberty here and add in a question of my own to sort of add the third layer to the cake here. Because I think one of the fundamental conundrums that people are wrestling with in the face of the research that you've presented is really this, right? I mean, resilience to climate change really depends on indigenous peoples and small-scale farmers and pastoralists, people who live land-based livelihoods, being able to continue to sustain themselves on their lands, because they also sustain the ecosystems and the more than human ecosystems that need to remain intact. But lithium mining proponents and clean energy transition proponents also feel really urgently that we have to get the minerals to transition to a post-carbon energy and transportation system, that it's vital, that it can't wait. And so this is a sort of reworking of the greater good type of thinking that then legitimates the kinds of sacrifice that you're talking about. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about ways that we might think about how to move beyond this kind of greater good thinking that always seems to involve the imposition of sacrifice on otherwise autonomous and resilient communities. So triple decker, right?
Yeah.
Sacrifice zones in the US, substantive touch points on extraction on indigenous peoples across the Americas. And then how might we move beyond this sort of framework that sees us pitting climate goals against indigenous peoples and livelihoods?
So great, those questions. And I'll try to do it. I don't know if I'm going to do it in 2 minutes. I'll try to do it in like 3 minutes or so. So if folks want to stay around. And if you can't, then that's fine. I won't be offended. So briefly, absolutely, we have seen sacrifice zones in the US around the hydrocarbon economy. We've seen it around the mining economy as well. Our mining laws in the US, I mean, it's interesting because environmental regulations in some ways are stringent in the US compared to for example, South America, but in other ways, like our actual mining laws are extremely lenient. Like you just stake a prospect and you start mining, and you can do it on public land, on private land. Like activists advocates in environmental NGOs have long called for like a substantial update to our 19th century mining law, right? And so yes, sacrifice zones always happen when there's this like, and Julie's work is key here, like this frontier hinterland mentality that just says, we want, we need your resources, we're going to come in and get them, and whatever stands in our way will be sacrificed. And I think that, if there was any doubt about this, then the North America sort of wide indigenous protest around pipeline constructions in tar sand and other unconventional oil deposits have really brought that to the forefront, right? And which is why I like to remind folks, and this is like an insight, of course, from critical geography and also from, I think, the more sophisticated forms of world systems theory, which is that periphery and center are relationships that redound sort of at every single scale, right? And they are internal to communities, they are internal to subnational units, they're internal to nations, and they're internal to the world order. It is not just about global North countries as if they are monoliths without their own deep inequalities, without their own dispossessed indigenous populations, without their own ecosystem harms, pitted against global South countries that are uniformly dispossessed as if the global South does not have its own elites. I mean, I think it's useful as a basic heuristic, the binary, but I think, within, we always have a sort of fractal kind of scalar production of those deep inequalities, including in the heart of empire in the US, right? And I think, the uranium lithium comparison is maybe more apropos than the question asker thinks, or maybe they're thinking in exactly this way, but I'll just note that Gabrielle Hecht's book, Being Nuclear, has been very influential to me, not just around like the localized deep public health and environmental harms of uranium extraction and the way that extractive nodes of supply chains are hidden from view in these kind of techno-futurist discourses, not just on that front, but specifically on the ways that both uranium and lithium are sort of rendered commodifiable, are rendered kind of legible in policy. I mean, I just can't recommend enough her book on that, and it's really helped me think through lithium as a planetary frontier. And so on the last point, yeah, it's interesting because I came to this project because of what I perceived to be a deep and maybe unresolvable tension between mitigating climate change through rapid and aggressive decarbonization on the one hand, and preserving and protecting not just ecosystem integrity, but as Julie said, the life worlds that enable that ecosystem integrity and vitality, right? And to me, those just seemed like they were at a zero-sum clash and lithium, was just a way to exemplify that. But, I was uncomfortable with that zero-sum framing just because literally it was uncomfortable because I had dueling kind of like commitments. Like on the one hand, indigenous rights, also labor rights, and also, ecosystem rights in the immediate sites of extraction. And on the other hand, reducing global warming, which is not just like some, desire of global north policymakers or advocates, but like the key demand of a global climate justice movement that includes many of the same communities that are harmed by the localized forms of extraction, right? So it's like very hard to sit with that. And, I tried to lean into the contradiction, but it just like, this feels like there must be a way to think about these things at the same time that renders them less zero sum. Like, it's not like we either deal with climate change or we protect local ecosystems. And I think what I've come around to, though, it's like an evolving thought process, is not so much that decarbonization and localized environmental protection are in conflict with one another, but more that the ecosystems and livelihoods and communities that Julie mentioned that are key to planetary health should be one of a few starting points to actually rethink what decarbonization means and how we go about it, right? And it should start from the premise that at the same time that we place a fundamental value on mitigating global warming, we also place a fundamental value on doing so in a way that is as unresource intensive and unland intensive, sorry, that's not the right way to frame that, resource unintensive, whatever. That's as least intensive on resources, energy, water, and land as possible, right? Because those having intensive use of those things not just creates forms of environmental harm, but actually makes the project of decarbonization more difficult. And I think that this is exemplified, and I'll end here at what I said at the very end. Sorry, I've gone on for like 5 minutes. I will end in this note. What I said at the very end of my talk, and it has a lot of good research behind it, but also total common sense behind it, which is that, the more cars we have on the road, the harder it is to decarbonize the transportation sector because each of those cars needs to be swapped. What if we started from a position of like, let's reduce the total volume of cars? Like, that's our approach to decarbonization, fewer cars as possible, and the remaining vehicles that are necessary for mobility reasons, for folks that are not going to be walking or cycling, for long distance transit reasons, whatever the reasons are that we do need some vehicles, let's focus on decarbonizing those. But if you have a sort of perspective that's informed by planetary limits as well as people's social and fundamental rights, and I think you just approach decarbonization in a different way that commits to rapidity, but doesn't mean that rapidity is the result of like rapaciousness, right? And I think that we kind of have to disentangle the speed at which we need to move with assuming that the speed implies like intensified extraction. I think the speed implies fast policy action, but the policy action could be, for example, as I just said, to reduce the number of cars on the road. Like, I want some really fast policy action there. Why don't we get fast action there and we get fast action on the extractive frontiers? I mean, I think that speaks to something about the dynamics of global capitalism. But I'll leave it there. And this was super useful for me. I really appreciate the comments and hope we can maybe save the chat because there's a lot in there.
Great. Thank you so much, Thea. I don't know, Julie, is Julie?
Julie was muted there. I think she was.
Yes. Yeah,
There we go. Yeah, I lost my privileges to unmute myself temporarily. I just wanted to say thank you so much on behalf of Eric Shelter, Salim Ali, the Center for the Sustainable Separation of Metals, the Minerals, Materials, and Society program. Thank you so much for being our inaugural speaker. And I really especially appreciate the parting thought that you've gifted to us, which is let's think through how to disentangle rapidity and rapaciousness. That's a really good thought to part on. All right, thank you so much, Thea. Thank you so much to the audience for your questions.